Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Connolly, and as the slide, which I believe you can see says, I am facilitating today's Hopkins Hour, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to participate in our conversation today. The topic is resilience in rehabilitation, and it strikes me, not least because we're in the mode of recovering from a flood, that this is an incredibly timely topic. It's also an incredibly important topic. Last night I picked up, for example, the most recent quarterly essay, the topic of which is mental health and mental illness in Australia. And as I started browsing, it was full of terrible stories actually about people's impediments to recovery, their difficulty in accessing systems, and yet there is real hope at the heart of it, that we have at our disposal concepts, we have skills, we have people with passion who are working together to build the mental wellness of Australians. And this today is the Hopkins Centre small contribution to that discourse and debate about building resilience in the context of rehabilitation. So I'm very pleased to be hosting today, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming people. I'm noticing there are many who are still joining us. So it'll be a few moments before we get to the actual presentations. And at this juncture, I'd like to do a couple of formal things. The first one is to acknowledge the country on which we are variously sitting, standing, potentially eating, at least listening. This country belongs and always has to the First Nations people, our Indigenous owners, people who've been here for, or their ancestors at least, for thousands and thousands of years. And it's incredibly important as we journey towards reconciliation, towards recognition. I understand today that one of the first truth commissions has started in Melbourne to uncover the experience of some of Australia's Aboriginal peoples, and resilience is an incredibly important topic within that community as well. So I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we are standing, sitting and eating today. I would like to pay my respects to the owners of the land, their elders, generations past, and to acknowledge the generations of the future. Just to get into a little bit of housekeeping, hopefully most of you by now are reasonably familiar with the way that Teams works. We have Michaela in the back who is facilitating the technology for us, and we'll be monitoring the chat throughout. So if at any point you run into any kind of difficulty, please feel free to indicate to Michaela and she will respond as soon as she is able. The chat serves another function for us. We are hoping that as the presentations progress, if you have questions, you will note them in the chat also, so that we can refer to them in the question and answer session a little later today. The final thing to note is that if you go into the More Actions button, which is at the top of the screen also, there's an option to close captions, so to have the captions appear on your screen, which you may wish to have also. Finally, I'll just note that the session is being recorded and it will be made available subsequently. If we are unable to get to everyone's questions within the hour, Michaela will facilitate sharing those with the panel and the speakers, putting together some responses to also communicate when we are able to upload this presentation. We note that there are a number of people with ill health and other reasons are unable to join us today, so hopefully they'll have the opportunity to listen to us at that stage. And we would love it if you are all able to share this with your friends and colleagues moving forward, because I think it will be a fascinating discussion. So our two formal presenters today are Michael Norwood, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Hopkins Centre, and Billy Hedderman, who is a citizen researcher at the Hopkins Centre. I asked Billy before we started how he would like me to introduce him to you, and he asked me not to say very much at all. So I'm going to leave it to Michael, actually, to tell you a little bit more about him when he gets a chance. But we're going to start now with Billy, so I'm going to put my microphone on silent and hand over to him.
Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks very much to everyone for inviting me along today. It's a real privilege to speak to members of the Hopkins Centre. So just by way of probably setting the scene, what Mike and I are looking to probably speak to today is basically our research paper around being asking the question, does being psychologically resilient assist in optimizing physical outcomes from a spinal cord injury? And between and Mike really led the research in relation to this himself, Ali, myself probably adding in a little bit, and obviously Elizabeth Kendall as well. So probably setting the scene and the impetus for the research is actually quite a personal and lived experience one. So back in late December of 2014, and as you can tell from the accent, I'm probably not originally from Australia, but my background is all in the military. So between both the Irish Defence Forces and then subsequently the Australian Defence Forces, I've got just under about 19 years done across both. But we came across in 2014 and just transferred from the Irish military into the ADF, and only unfortunately 3 months into that period of time, I suffered a significant accident actually in Caloundra in Kings Beach, where unfortunately I stuck my head into the water, and well, it was a surfing accident, to put it mildly. But essentially I broke my C3, C4. I had a minute fracture of the T5, but obviously damaged my spinal cord there and then, which rendered me instantly paralyzed. So upon removal to Nambour Hospital and then subsequently getting choppered to the PA Hospital, I was diagnosed with incomplete quadriplegia, central cord syndrome at that C3, C4 level, where the initial, I suppose, what I had left in terms of movement was a toe and a thumb, not necessarily a completely terrible outcome considering an incomplete injury. And also, I suppose, to put in context, no bowel, bladder or sexual function at that stage. So that's probably the impetus. It was a lived experience on that, and throughout the various number of months in recovery at the PA Hospital, and it just so happens that Professor Garrity, who I think is Deputy Director at the Hopkins Centre, was one of my treating doctors at the time. I'm not sure if he's on, but if so, I'm sure he'd be horrified to see me again. I joke, but I think it was about 4.5 months, which of course in spinal cord injury terms would be not a particularly long period of time to be in the spinal injuries unit. But essentially there was a number of key stepping stones in terms of the rehabilitation that occurred during that period, which essentially gave me quite a favourable physical outcome thereafter. So even probably recovery and rehabilitation even beyond hospital, where I was able to reintegrate back into the Australian military, where they continued the support beyond probably the hospitalization, the rehabilitation in hospital. But I think what we actually linked it to, and what was quite interesting, was the personal levels of resilience that I had probably managed to gain through years of lived experience. So the vast majority of my military experience included serving in units, special forces units, where the selection process and the type of work that we do is pretty high level, and even probably getting exposure to things like resistance to interrogation and quite heavy going things that I suppose would have I suppose we had a perception that there was an enhanced level of psychological resilience prior to injury. So it was an interesting kind of an aspect to it. And realistically, the question that I had started asking myself was the outcome in relation to probably my favorable physical recovery in any way enhanced by psychological resilience. Now, I think the next slide kind of gives it, it's a little bit of a video clip, and I do apologize. There's a bit of it that's, I'll probably put my hand up and cringe when I see it, particularly at the very start when they quote the doctor bit and at the end, but it was done by the publishers afterwards. So, but we'll play it, I suppose, just to give an indication of the recovery flow, if that makes sense. Thanks, Mike.
Step. Yeah. Lean forward. and then taking away from the right step.
Will I do a little strut? How's that there?
Thanks, Mike. There we go. And I do apologize. It's pretty dramatic, but and the music is I think I've heard that too many times. But so look, there was favorable outcomes, and even beyond, I suppose, 2015 reintegration back into the military, being able to deploy on operations again, which was fantastic, and continuously you probably push on even from there, and now even out in the now that I've left the military, probably on my own terms and what I do in terms of a day job is crisis and incident management consultations. So it was fantastic to be able to get to that level of rehabilitation, but on probably further, I suppose, research and discussion, particularly with my friend and colleague Mike, we probably took a look at a couple of things. One was, bracketing probably some of the stuff around SCI itself, noting that it's probably, mental adversity beyond the physical, of course, as well. We know, of course, it's an increased risk of our early mortality, the economic cost, the personal, societal, the whole lot, and of course, being incomplete and the nature and the difference between incomplete and complete. In terms of rehabilitation, then when we were looking at it, obviously we noted the individual differences, everything, and including in my case, social support being a key factor in that, age, education level, physical fitness before, but probably pre-injury stress events or even personal resilience. And what was the level, for instance, that personal resilience or psychological resilience may or may not have? And of course, like what the particular and of interest probably to us was, does that equate to a separate or a different level of intervention in relation to probably techniques? And the last part, probably when we talked about resilience, all we wanted to do was probably frame that around what exactly we were talking about, and basically that it wasn't to be, I suppose, it wasn't a thing of social or environmental resilience, but essentially we were talking about an adapting and coping response to adversity. So all that really does is, I suppose, to start off, framed the question or the problem set that we had, which then kind of led us to believe, okay, let's see what's out there. Let's actually do something and see, is it just an exciting or a happy coincidence for me, or is there actually something deeper to that? So with that, I might hand over to Mike, where he talks about kind of where we took it from there in relation to probably the methodology and the question around the actual research itself. So thanks, Mike. Are you with us, Mike? You may not be.
We seem to have just lost Mike for a moment.
That's okay, Michaela. Perhaps I'll start by asking a question. I'd really love to know how you actually define resilience, if you were to put it in terms that anyone could understand on the basis of your experience. What would you say it means?
Yeah, thanks very much, Judy. I think there's a difference between probably robustness and resilience. Like robustness, I would say, is actually, like people would, in common terms or even in business nowadays, say, oh, it's mental toughness or the ability to keep going. Whereas I think in this particular instance is as much about actually adapting and acknowledging your circumstances and being able to change that. So stuff like your growth mindset, attitudes and stuff like that, and how the way I kind of looked at it was, look, there was so much outside of my control that I could or couldn't do, but it was the gap between what I could get back and what I would get back that basically if I worked really, really hard, particularly in all the rehabilitation stuff, and my motivating factors were up as high as they could, then at least I could get back as much as I could in relation to that. So that's what I would see as probably from a layman's terms, resilience, the way I was looking at it, probably adaptability more so than actual robustness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating and really helpful. Thank you. So, Mike, we might turn over to you now if you're ready.
Yeah, thank you for that. So thanks, Billy. So Julie did suggest I do another intro of Billy's. As I met Billy when he was quite far through this rehab process, I suppose. He wasn't quite at that last scene where he's walking the dog, but he was actually on a mutual friend's stag do, and even then he was sort of, I remember him carrying trays of drinks and not letting people necessarily come and do everything for him. So I think the rehabilitation process was always maybe on your mind, Billy, and you were sort of always thinking about it and working on it. And since then, he's written that book and he's done lots of talks like this about it, because it was, a remarkable amount of recovery. So the question essentially from, as Billy mentioned, just trying to change this slide. I'll give it a minute. Okay, so yeah, the question we're asking is about the effect of resilience or resilience training on physical outcomes, specifically in an SCI. And we felt that, Billy had done a lot of thinking about this, and at the end of his book, he has sort of done his own sort of research, but we decided that maybe a more systematic approach to this, to answer this question or to see what was out there, maybe the question had already been answered or at least discussed. So we thought we'd do a sort of systematic search of the literature to look at the questions. So does being psychologically resilient assist in optimizing physical outcomes from a spinal cord injury? I'm going to briefly, Billy got to do all the, more interesting stuff. I'll do the dry methods here. So I want to briefly talk about the review approach we took. So when we're sort of working out how to ask this question, we decided that a systematic approach was necessary. So a systematic review, you're all probably familiar with a systematic review. But one way of describing it is it's a method to identify and retrieve evidence for a particular question, to synthesize the results and to inform practice and policy. So systematic reviews are widely used to inform the development of trustworthy clinical guidelines. So they're sort of the gold standard in this reviewing of the literature. The other approach that I'm going to discuss today is the systematic scoping review, which is essentially what we ended up doing. And this is an extension on the systematic review. I think it's a bit sort of newer. The guidelines are more recent. And some of the key differences you can see in that quote. So the synthesizing of the results, that's not as important for a scoping review, and informing practice and policy, that's sort of essential for a systematic review. Whereas for a scoping review, it's not. And we'll talk a bit more about these differences. So there's actually quite a lot that they have in common. The systematic review and the systematic scoping review, they both have a protocol that you come up with prior to running any searches. They're systematic, of course, it's in the name. You should be able to repeat them, and it's an exhaustive literature search. So essentially, a narrative review is more subjective, Whereas a systematic review, because you're doing it in this exhaustive searching where you've got a protocol, you've got a method, you've got search terms, essentially you're trying to, an ideal outcome is you capture all of the papers relevant to your question. And you can do that with this systematic search and the systematic and eligibility criteria. And they're both aiming to do that in some ways. So therefore they're transparent, you keep a track of all your methods, you've done your protocol a priori, they're reproducible. Essentially someone could do it at the same, for the same, search the same dates you've searched with the same search terms, with the same eligibility criteria, and you should get the same results. So if it's in the best way, it's taken out that subjective approach to a review of the literature. So you're reducing error, it's more reliable. The data is also structured, so you're extracting the data from the papers you read in a more structured way. And we'll talk a bit more about these later on. But there are key differences. So, I mean, a systematic review, you're aiming to establish the quality of the evidence. So you're trying to confirm or refute a practice, an intervention, or maybe a medicine. So you're getting all the literature to help you do that. It helps you identify gaps in the research, deficiencies, and trends in the research. And it can help identify and inform future research and decision making. A scoping review is different, and it's a broader approach. So it's often called reconnaissance, in that they're quite useful when a body of literature hasn't maybe been comprehensively reviewed before. So your questions are a bit broader. You are essentially trying to map the evidence, map the literature, maybe identify what definitions or concepts are being used. And it's often after the systematic scoping review, you might then have some ideas for a more systematic review. So what narrower questions you can ask. And so there might be a precursor to a systematic review. They're not, again, not to be confused with a traditional literature review. They still are systematic. You're still putting your protocol out there, and they should be able to be reproduced and get the same findings. So it still should be less subjective than a sort of narrative review. But so, I mean, some of the key differences are that, so the systematic review is like specific, like I mentioned, it's a narrow question compared to broad. There's a checklist you have to go through, and you submit this with your review, so reviewers and journals know that you've done this systematically, and they know where to find the information to identify it as this type of review. There's more in a systematic review, and that reflects the fact you're supposed to be doing. You can speak to the quality of the papers you've included. You might be able to do a meta-analysis where you do use statistics on all the data in each paper, and implications for practice are essential. Essentially, the idea is you're asking a very specific, clinically meaningful question, and that's why you need to do quality analysis, because it helps you with the implications for practice. If the quality of the studies is poor, it affects what you can say about implications for practice. Scoping review, it's broader. We're not asking a specific question, so you don't necessarily need to do these quality assessments, and you can make suggestions on implications of practice, but they'd be more limited because you're not able to synthesize all the papers together, because it's a much broader net that you've cast. So why did we choose a scoping review in the end? We had a broad question, essentially, and a question that hadn't been comprehensively reviewed in the past. So it was partly it was broad because resilience itself, a physical impairment, these are all quite complex and varied in their definitions, so that even though it may look like it was a relatively narrow question, it ended up being quite a broad inclusion criteria. I'm trying to map essentially how people had defined resilience or measured resilience in that sense. So we had broad search terms, and we included all study types. It also meant we couldn't synthesize it as well as we could if it was a more narrow question. The other reason we chose a scoping review is essentially because the reviewer told us to. This is where I embarrassed myself in front of my supervisors by making it clear I have some flaws as a researcher, although they probably already guessed that. But essentially, I submitted it as a systematic review, and I thought that question was quite narrow. We had a population, we had an intervention essentially, which was resilience, but essentially the reviewers have said, and that this is only a small part of their. They were very clear in their feedback. So one thing I learned is that the reviewer is always right as well. But we had a discussion about it. That was actually quite a good process with the review process, and essentially decided that they were right. So our search strategy, we had two search strings, so spinal cord injury and resilience. We searched them in 5 databases. And in the eligibility criteria, that's when we looked at the physical rehabilitation outcomes. So you can see how it's more of it, and I did agree with the reviewer in the end. It was quite broader in its scope. The definitions were relatively well, they weren't well defined, and the literature hasn't well defined, and resilience is quite fraught in that nature. But in terms of our resilience, we made sure it was psychological or personal resilience. So we're trying to not include social or environmental resilience. So it was quite tricky in that sense because of how resilience sits in the literature and how it's defined and how it's described, and it was all quite different amongst the papers as well. And again, that's why that was they were correct in it being a scoping review. So then you remove duplicates from the 5 different search databases, and then we do the eligibility criteria on the titles, the abstract, and the full text. So narrowing it down into the papers we're going to include. And all of this process so far is the same thing you do for a scoping review and a systematic review at this stage. So the main difference is essentially the broadness of the question at this stage and your inclusion criteria. So we started off all the databases. We ended up with 1,806 papers. At each title review, abstract review, we excluded on the eligibility criteria, and you ended up with just 12. The data extraction, and again, this is something that's similar between scoping reviews and systematic reviews, but as I mentioned before, how it's quite structured. So we have an Excel spreadsheet, we've got all these columns, and we read the papers that we've included and extract that data in a structured way. And again, this all helps with it being quite able to be reproduced. If someone did it again, they should, in theory, get the same outcome. It's obviously not as perfect as that because there's still human involvement, but that's the idea. So this is what we found. We found 12 studies included, 8 of them in the US, others in Europe. 2 of them were qualitative, 10 were quantitative, and essentially we found 6 showing that resilience did have a positive effect on physical functioning or recovery, and 6 that showed it did not have an effect. There weren't any that showed a negative effect, which was, I guess, expected, but we did have a direct split on positive and neutral findings. So essentially, one of the main findings is that there was a lack of research out there. There's only 12 papers that came up, and even then, there was quite broad in our inclusion. The definitions, it wasn't always the primary point of the research wasn't necessarily resilience and physical outcomes. So there is a lack of research that looks at this. It's not clear why. But tentatively, you might say it could have resilience might affect physical outcomes in a positive way, because we had 6 that showed it was positive and 6 more neutral. We also found that in those that didn't find an effect, they all used the same measure, which is the Connor-Davidson resilience scale, but they used the short version. And that doesn't cover a wide variety of characteristics of resilience. It focuses on hardiness, and there's other aspects that the full scale and other scales include, such as control taking. And there was another study that actually found positive outcomes in terms of control taking using a different scale, but they still didn't find anything with hardiness. So it's possible that it was the measurement bias here that showed no effect. One of the key findings was that past resilience building experiences did contribute to physical improvement, and that was interesting because that linked in with what Billy perceives and experienced in his rehabilitation. And again, we're still involved. We asked that question because of this experience, but because we used a systematic approach, we took out a lot of that subjectivity and still found this. Past resilience building experiences might include growth after trauma, and trauma in the papers it included parental divorce or other previous injuries, or even just being involved in sport and competition. Strength-based approaches, which is essentially related to resilience, they were far better than emotional education, and building a sense of control seemed to be associated with positive outcomes. On the flip side, a negative approach had negative effects. So threat and loss appraisals of injury and rehabilitation compared to, I guess, more positive or a challenging appraisal of it. So essentially, future research, there's not much, like we said, there's not much in this field. So we can essentially have research needs to establish if resilient characteristics can contribute to greater physical recovery. it looks like they might, but we can't say that for sure. It's a scoping review. Those implications are not as strong. Or maybe even just help engagement in physical rehabilitation, which will then contribute to that recovery. Also, future research might look at prior resilient experiences and maybe distinguish between resilience as a product of an SCI or these prior resilient experiences before the SCI has happened, and how they can both affect recovery. And that essentially leads to sort of key research questions from this review, which is, how do pre-injury levels of resilience affect physical rehab? And the second one that didn't come up, or I must have flipped through, is essentially how can resilience as a result of the SCI, how can we establish resilience as a result of the current sort of traumatic experience, and how that can contribute to rehab. So even though it's not a systematic review, I feel like there's some implications for practice. So essentially, past events might promote a resilient response. It's possible that we can draw upon these past experiences and try and distinguish between one that was sort of traumatic and created a stress experience which was negative, and the ones that actually resulted in that resilient response. Maybe, if it's possible, how can we use that to motivate or to increase participation in rehab, or increase that resilient they're feeling in that moment. Building a sense of control in the rehabilitation process and on their recovery appears to be, from this limited sort of data, more effective than, say, focus on emotional coping. And it's actually maybe that looking for the presence of these negative appraisals, as opposed to looking for sort of the presence or absence of resilience, which might be important anyway, but looking for the presence of the opposite of resilience, these negative appraisals might be a greater indicator of who would benefit from sort of psychoeducational training or resilience training. I don't know if you get the slides afterwards, but I've grouped some references into a few of these slides, including the ones on systematic and scoping reviews and the differences, and the studies we included in this paper. And I think I'm passing on to Julie now.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was fascinating. And just for all those who are listening, one of the things that we've been talking about for the Hopkins Hours this year is that wherever possible, we're going to try and build in to the presentations a discussion around the methodological choices that were made to create the research, partially because what we're hoping to do is not only convey the findings and have an interesting discussion about them, but build the capability of all of our audience members to be able to kind of engage with the substantive processes of research and possibly be inspired to do further research themselves. So thank you, Michael, for taking that to heart and giving us such a great presentation accordingly. Now, my great pleasure at this moment is to introduce two clinicians who are going to join me in a panel to respond to and discuss the presentations that were just given. While we're doing that, I'm hoping that more of you will type some questions in our chat. There's a couple there now, one for Billy, and we will return to have all four people discussing at the very end, but right now I'm going to ask Dr. Karen and Sue Booth to join me. So Karen is from the Acquired Brain Injury Transitional Rehabilitation Service. She's a clinical lead, and Sue is a social worker from the Transitional Rehabilitation Program, both working in the Division of Rehabilitation at the Princess Alexandra Hospital. So I'm very glad that they were able to join us. We had a third person who was scheduled to participate, but unfortunately is unwell. So what I'd like to start is just asking both of our panelists to give us a reflection or an observation based on what they've heard just now from Billy and Michael. Sue, do you think I could start with you?
I was afraid you'd ask me that, but very happy to do so. As Billy was talking, I recognised his experience in the outcomes that he got. And when I look at the time that I've spent with spinal cord injury as a social worker, I was an old graduate. And then when I my first job was in the spinal injuries unit. And at that stage, one of the things they asked me to do was interview about 100 people that had had spinal cord injury. And the thing that I learnt from that experience was that it did not, the level of injury and disability, resultant disability or the outcomes, did not really relate to the injury. It was about other factors that were at work in terms of promoting, I'll use the word resilience, but I probably didn't think of it in that way, of promoting their resilience and also their motivation and ongoing hope. So that I found that. So I then thought, well, there's other factors at play. One of the things I noticed in the spinal injuries unit, and that the senior social worker who was there when I started, Pat Dorset, said to me was go down and talk to the readmissions because that came into the unit, mainly with very significant pressure area surgery and, needs. Talk to them about their lived experience. And once again, the outcomes that they got wasn't necessarily related to what their circumstances were. It was more about the journey that they'd been on and some of the things that had happened to them. But it wasn't about their resilience or their motivation or anything like that in a lot of cases. And then the other thing that taught me a little bit about what makes me relate to what Billy was saying was the other extreme, where when I was in the unit, we ended up with about 4 people on ventilators. And which is, the highest you can go really, unless you combine it with a acquired brain injury as well. And the thing, once again, that was very obvious to me was that these were the people with the spinal cord injury that had absolutely no control, no so I found that things like self-efficacy, their sense of being in control, and the support they got around that and their resilience was really important in the way that they dealt with, in the longer term, that they dealt with that terrible loss of functional abilities. So since then, I've been since 1998 in the transitional rehabilitation program, and so I see people a lot further along the journey, and I have a range of things that I look at in that transition, because what people are dealing with, even on a common topic like that sense of loss of independence and being a burden, is very different when it's in your own home than it is when you're in the hospital, where you expect people to look after you and, all that kind of thing. So the thing that I picked up a lot from what Billy and the research was looking at was I really truly believe in a strengths-based approach, and I think that that's a really important factor in outcomes for people once they try to re-establish their life. So those were just some comments that I thought about as I was listening to that and trying to relate it to my observations and experiences over a long, long time in spinal cord injury.
Thank you, Sue. That's fascinating, the way that you have drawn our attention to the fact that the continuum is long and there are multiple points on it, and at those different points, different kinds of factors might have a role in mediating the physiological outcomes. That's really fascinating. Thank you. Karen, can I turn to you and ask you for your initial thoughts and observations on our presentation today?
Yeah, I'd like to start by thanking you guys for some amazing research. I think it's a really good topic and it feels really relevant right at this point in time. And I think that this topic of resilience in rehabilitation is broader than one client group or one population, and is something we should be looking at around all our rehab practitioners, regardless of where we're working. And I really like that thought of what can we be working with our clients on that they have that ability to bring to the table, and what are those past experiences and resilience and those skills they're bringing that we can foster in a strengths-based way. And I think, Sue, I agree with everything you've said. I work in with people who have acquired brain injury, and we see similar things there, that people who tend to have higher levels of resilience coming in, and some of those traits that support resilience and better social supports tend to have outcomes including better quality of life, better self-reported mental health. So I think that this ingrained resilience we bring into a situation, I wonder how can we harness that better as people and as a workforce, and how do we help people who've got good resilience? What can we do for them, and how are the ways that we might be building resilience in people who might not be the most resilient to start with? And I think when we look around us just as a general population, we see people who are highly resilient and we see people who aren't, and I think we might end up with quite different ways we might work with these people, because I think it's a really emerging area of research. But I think that it goes across regardless of what type of injury or potential disability someone's having. I think that these strengths-based approaches are really important. And I also think there's a lot of work to be done on how do we measure resilience. Are we talking about the same thing? I know definition is a real issue, and that you guys would have found that trying to organise your articles. But I think that there are benefits not just for the people we're working with, but also for their families is probably the other area I think we need to look at next too.
Karen, I think you've outlined quite a comprehensive research program there. Sounds very exciting. But before I bring the others back in, can I just ask both of you, and maybe we'll start with you this time, Karen, in terms of, as you note, resilience is a term that has a great deal of breadth, and probably people use it in different kinds of ways, or perhaps they don't even use the term, but they might be referring to something like self-efficacy or capacity to adapt, which was what Billy mentioned earlier. And in what you've observed of people working, your colleagues, how do you think that they do build strength? Like, are there processes at play at the moment, even if we don't have the evidence base at hand?
That's a great question, and I did a little bit of reading in preparation for this and reflected that against my clinical practice. And Sue, I feel terrible I'm going first in this, because I think you as a social worker probably have a lot more things to say about working in some of these ways. I think there are some really specific interventions that we do in our rehab that use some of these approaches, and I think particularly our psychologists and our social workers work with people actively work on resilience. They work on processes related to coping. They might be working on doing things like cognitive behavioural therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, values-based interventions. And I think that these really focus on a resilience building and looking at those strengths-based approaches and what people bring of their own previous experiences. And I think that's regular practice for some of our workforce. I don't know how well we harness that as a team moving forwards, and I think we should. I also think, though, there are lots of things we do in our practice that address different aspects of this broad thing of resilience, such as some of our cognitive behavioural interventions, working with people on emotional regulation, social skills training, work around communication and problem solving, behaviour management. So all of these things tap into different aspects of a resilience. So I think that we're addressing aspects broadly in a way, but maybe not targeted and maybe not really specifically or coherently as a team. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I would imagine that there are kind of lots of folk definitions of what resilience is and what it means in the process of rehabilitation that are held by members of staff who utilise that, as you say, in their daily practice in multiple ways. And it would be interesting to have a coherent and harnessed approach. I think that's a great thing about one of these conversations, that something like that comes to light. But Sue, perhaps you can speak to that in greater detail from your experience also.
Thank you. Once again, I agree with everything you've said, Karen. I didn't quite do the preparation, but here are some comments. When I first started in the spinal injuries unit, and I'm talking about a way a team operates, and I find that in the transitional rehab program as well, right? So the pathways to building resilience are all intermeshed with the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary team, really. And it may, for instance, and I don't know whether Billy found this, but it may, for instance, be having a physio that actually takes your goal and then breaks it down so that you can start. So it might be a goal to walk, and you can start building those skills, and the person themselves feels like they've set the agenda, and that the physiotherapist is using her skills and enhancing that progress for them. The OT might be looking at having their house, their situation, their work, you know, providing opportunities to see potential in what they might be able to do in the future, because it's they look at the daily living stuff. I think the nursing staff play a huge role in addressing on a 24-hour basis that emotional distress, because they're on the floor in the night and all that kind of thing. So from a social work perspective and psychology perspective, I think it's your sessions in those early stages need to be about, you have to address the emotional distress. I don't think people have to be able to you know, acknowledge their losses and sadness and to grieve those. So you facilitate that, but I've always tried to, at the end of those sessions, try to get a little bit of a lift where we look for a way to move forward. But the most important thing, in whether it's in those early days in the unit or when a person comes home and you see them in their own environment, is to understand their beliefs, their values, what coping skills they've got that they can adapt. How can you promote their self-efficacy and them thinking of themselves in a positive way? So it might be that they were a kid that worked at Macca's, but you look for what things they learnt or what qualities they have that they can be proud of and utilise where they are right now. So so I'm coming from a teams approach, and our team out in the community, which I'm sure Karen would know from the ABIOS team and now their TCP team, it is all about the team, because when you go into, mainly about the client, but it's about how the team works together and manages that, because when you go into somebody's home, then you have to deal with what's happening on the day, or you do joint visits or whatever. So I think the way to promote a way forward is to address both the physical, the living situation, and the immense psychological impact. And grief.
Sorry, did I cut you off, Sue?
No.
No, thank you. I might draw Michael and Billy back into the conversation now, because I think there's a really nice overlap between some of what you were saying about the fact that, in building resilience, you can't deny that there's also kind of grief and loss in this, which picks up on something Billy said when I asked him a question earlier, which was that resilience is quite different to robustness, that there's the capacity to adapt, not simply to kind of just push back or not be affected by things that are happening to you. So Billy, could I ask you to respond to maybe the things that Sue was saying from your experience? Does it resonate? What would you add?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one quick query to Sue. Sue, did you call out to my house? Were you part of that home visit? You may or may not recall, but I believe you actually were my home social work visitor a number of years ago.
Was.
There you go.
Yes, I was.
Well, I've got a great story then that actually completely links in on this one, because when we talk about probably resilience, and I remember at the time I had a hour by hour program that I printed off for myself that was on the fridge that I was running through, and I very proudly brought Sue over to that to point it to her, to show her how. And when we're talking about robustness, that's probably what I was doing. I was saying I'm doing this, but through probably Sue's years of experience and actually reading what was going on, she very subtly managed to convince me that actually there was much more to just that aspect of it, that there was actually the emotional part of it, and that I actually needed to at times disengage with that and actually start coming back into a social setting and spending more time, let's say, with my wife, as opposed to just doing the OT constantly or just doing the physio stuff, which I thought was really, really interesting. And it actually stuck with me. And I think it actually in turn improved overall physical outcomes, because it felt like all of a sudden a valve had been released and there was less pressure to have these just physical achievements or goals. So it was really interesting, and it ties back into actually the different, and maybe it's completely different, but it could be people with different motivating factors or whatever. And that was something that me and Mike were talking about, like when we're looking at future research, it could be something around is it used for like different people who have had this level or that level, or different types of push-pull factors or motivating factors for people might lead to different interventions in relation to how we could maximize potential physical outcomes. So it was something that we were really interested in. But while I have you, I'd like to say thanks very much, Sue, because that was an awesome piece of advice that I really took to heart. So.
Oh, that's really lovely. And Billy, I'm going to come back to you in a second, because one of the questions in the chat is for you. But Michael, I just thought I might bring you in now. And Karen mentioned in her comments that one of the things that she's interested in is having measurement tools that enable you to really conceptualize what resilience is. And I noticed in your presentation that you indicated that there's one that's used often but did not seem comprehensive. I was wondering if you could speak further to the relationship between the way that the literature is conceptualizing resilience, which is a broad and complex topic, and the way it's being measured.
Yeah, no, it's I made a note on that point, that when Karen was discussing it, it is, and going back to that systematic scoping versus systematic, like it was a good reason for it to be a scoping review, because the definition, finding resilience, like it was quite difficult to do, and we essentially had to choose one and be quite broad about it, and it's just sort of note that it's not that the defining it is actually very difficult, and move on. And then I think there's a comment about social resilience and environmental resilience. So then you've got to measure all these different types of resilience. And I think although we're focusing on psychological or personal resilience, Billy's talked about in his recovery, in his rehabilitation, and he just mentioned it then about spending time with his wife and focusing on these like that. He's talked about it, that it wasn't just this past experience and personal resilience that helped him sort of make such a dramatic recovery, but the social help that he had in the environment, in the PA with the setup they've got there. So there's all these different factors of resilience that will assist in rehabilitation, and that Billy's talked about in his own. But yeah, in terms of research, like the definition needs to be sorted before any sort of systematic review can happen, because you can't ask a very specific question if you can't define resilience, or at least use a very well-defined version of resilience. I think what would be really interesting is Karen mentioned how they have those resilient sort of factors integrated throughout current interventions. And I think a really sort of interesting project would be to sort of identify throughout this rehab process and in these different programs where those moments of resilience building are, and what type of resilience. And then you can sort of quantify in the current rehab process how much resilience training or moments are there already embedded, and what category, what type of resilience, so social, environmental, or sort of personal. In terms of just the measurement now, I mean, what we learned was that you have a comprehensive measure of resilience would be needed. Like that short measure didn't really work. Just focusing on hardiness, which was what they did, didn't seem to work. And the measures that had a broader, tried to capture that broader, I guess, definition of resilience seemed to show more associations with positive outcomes. And interestingly, even in those, hardiness didn't. So the type of measure you would pick would be, something that's got a broader scope on that definition. But I think, what would be really interesting is not, because I guess we're that sort of going from the research and then to the rehab process. And what would be really interesting was to be like, well, actually, how is resilience already in the rehab process, and how can that inform sort of how we define it or where we go in the research from that? So there's obviously no clear answer because we haven't got a strong definition, but there's lots of sort of interesting further questions we can ask about that definition. But at the moment, being broad with it, I think would be key.
Great, thank you. Billy's had to go now. He's got another meeting to go to, which is a pity because I was going to ask him one final question, but hopefully we'll have another chance to talk to him at some later date. So maybe I could go back to Sue and Karen and ask from your perspective in terms of working, picking up on what Michael just said, that there are multiple elements of resilience. What is it that you find yourself thinking about when you're doing your work? Like which parts of it? Just as a final comment, because we'll have to finish up soon. So maybe Karen, you could go first.
I like thinking about that a strengths-based. So have you been in this situation before? What have you done? What worked? What didn't work? So actually starting with a previous success of someone, and then how can you use that with whatever aspect you're working on next? I think that's a really positive and works with a lot of strategy-based interventions for us in people with brain injury. Sue, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I would go along the strengths-based scale as well. I think that with the strengths-based one, you've also got to find a way to build somebody's confidence that even if they haven't got these skills now, they have the capability with support to develop them. And along with that, people can lose hope that they will never change, things will never change. And I think one of the things we do is we do a measurement before and at the end of our program to see, it's basically a achievement thing, but from their perspective, is I like to run over all the goals they had and then get them to reflect on where they've come from. So I think if you don't know where you've come from and acknowledge your small gains, then you can't build on that, because the hopelessness and despair, or being not coming from a strength, seeing yourself as strong, it negates that. So
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for those final reflections. I think I might start to draw us to a close now. It's been a fabulous discussion, a great way for us to kick off this year's Hopkins Hours, and so I'm immensely grateful to all of our speakers, to Mike, to Billy, and to Karen and Sue for joining us in the discussion. I hope that you who have been listening have enjoyed this also. We don't have too many questions in the chat, but if something did occur to you, you can always get in contact with us, and we look forward to engaging with you with further of these events as the year progresses. So thank you very much.